Welcome, traveller of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. But first, let me give you a glimpse of just how mind-blowing this gets. Picture this. A Viking woman could divorce her husband simply by declaring it in front of witnesses. She could inherit land, run businesses, and even demand compensation if someone insulted her honor. Yet this same woman could be killed by her own family for refusing an arranged marriage. She could lead religious ceremonies that determined the fate of entire communities, but she couldn't speak at the local assembly that decided everyday laws. By the end of this series, you'll understand why Viking women were simultaneously the most liberated and most constrained women in all of medieval Europe. You'll discover archaeological evidence that proves some of the most legendary shield maidens actually existed, and you'll learn about the secret power structures that allowed certain women to control vast networks of trade and influence across the known world. Now, before we dive into these 7 contradictions, I need to address something that most historians completely overlook. The story of Viking women isn't just about gender roles in the past. It's about understanding how societies can create systems where the same person can be both powerful and powerless, depending on the context. This pattern shows up throughout history, and recognizing it helps us understand power dynamics that still exist today. The first contradiction that will blow your mind is the legal paradox. Viking women enjoyed legal rights that wouldn't be seen in most of Europe for another 500 years. Under Norse law, a woman could own property in her own name. She could buy and sell land, livestock, and goods without needing permission from any man. If her husband died, she automatically inherited a portion of his wealth, and nobody could take that away from her. But here's where it gets twisted. These same legal codes that gave women property rights also treated them as property themselves in certain situations. A father could sell his daughter into marriage without her consent. If a woman was raped, the crime was considered property damage against her male guardian, not an assault against her personally. The compensation went to her father or husband, not to her. This creates a fascinating question. How could a society that recognized women as capable property owners simultaneously treat them as property to be owned? The answer lies in understanding that Viking law wasn't designed around individual rights as we think of them today. Instead, it was built around family honor and economic stability. When a Viking woman inherited land, she wasn't just gaining personal wealth. She was becoming the custodian of her family's legacy and the economic foundation for future generations. This gave her enormous practical power. Archaeological evidence from sites like Birka in Sweden shows us wealthy female graves filled with merchant scales, indicating these women were running international trade operations. But this power came with crushing responsibility. A woman who inherited significant property also inherited the obligation to make strategic marriages that would strengthen her family's political position. She might control vast wealth, but she couldn't always control how that wealth was used or who she shared it with. The second contradiction involves the religious sphere, where Viking women wielded influence that would make medieval Christian women envious, yet faced restrictions that seem impossible to reconcile. Norse religion placed women at the center of some of its most important practices. The Völur, or seeresses, were exclusively female religious practitioners who claimed to communicate directly with the gods and predict the future. These women traveled from settlement to settlement, performing rituals that could determine whether a community would go to war, where they would establish new farms, or how they would survive harsh winters. Kings and jarls would delay major decisions until they could consult with a Volva. In the famous saga of Eric the Red, an entire Greenland settlement nearly starves because they're waiting for a seeress to perform the rituals needed to ensure a successful hunt. The archaeological record backs this up. Female graves from the Viking Age often contain what researchers call ritual staffs, long iron rods that were likely used in religious ceremonies. These staffs are found almost exclusively in women's graves, and they're often accompanied by other ritual objects like amulets, crystals, and exotic beads from as far away as India and Byzantium. But here's the contradiction that will make your head spin. While these same women could claim divine authority that even kings respected, they were completely excluded from the thing, the local assemblies where everyday legal and political decisions were made. A vulva could prophesy that the gods demanded a particular course of action, and powerful men would listen. But she couldn't vote on whether to build a new bridge or settle a property dispute between neighbours. This wasn't just an oversight in the legal system. It was a deliberate separation of spiritual and temporal power that reveals something crucial about how Viking society functioned. The Norse believed that women had a special connection to the supernatural world that made them ideal intermediaries between humans and gods. But this same belief also suggested that women were somehow less suited for the practical, everyday business of running a community. Think about how strange this must have been in practice. Imagine a scenario where a vulva declares that the gods have revealed the location of a new silver mine. And based on her prophecy, dozens of men pack up their families and travel hundreds of miles to establish a new settlement. But when they arrive and need to decide how to divide up the mining claims, that same vulva has no official voice in the discussion. The third contradiction takes us into the realm of violence and warfare, where the gap between Viking women's theoretical and actual power becomes even more dramatic. This is where we encounter the legendary shield maidens, and I need to tell you up front that separating fact from fiction here is incredibly challenging. The sagas are filled with stories of warrior women who fought alongside men in battle. Lagertha, who supposedly fought with Ragnar Lothbrok. Freydis Eriksdotter, who defended Vinland against Native American attacks while pregnant. Hervor, who retrieved her father's cursed sword from his burial mound and used it to lead a warband. For decades, historians dismissed these stories as pure fantasy. After all, medieval chroniclers loved to exaggerate, and warrior women made for exciting tales that probably bore little resemblance to reality. But then, archaeologists started making discoveries that changed everything. In the 1880s, archaeologists excavated a grave at Birka that contained the remains of a person buried with a full set of weapons: sword, axe, spear, arrows, and 2 shields. For over a century, everyone assumed this was obviously a male warrior. The grave even became known as BJ 581 and was used as a textbook example of a high-ranking Viking warrior burial. Then, in 2017, DNA analysis revealed something shocking. The warrior engraved, BJ 581, was female. Not only that, but the burial included gaming pieces, suggesting this woman was a military strategist, not just a foot soldier. She was buried with the honors of a military commander. This discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, but it also raised more questions than it answered. If shield maidens existed, and if at least some of them held high military rank, why do we have so little other evidence of female warriors? Why don't the law codes mention them? Why don't contemporary accounts from other cultures describe encountering Viking warrior women? The answer might lie in understanding that Viking society made a distinction between different types of female power that we're only beginning to recognize. A woman might wield a sword in defense of her family or community without being considered a professional warrior. She might lead a raiding party without being part of the regular military hierarchy. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of Viking women's lives that historians often miss. Power in Norse society wasn't always official or institutional. Much of it operated through informal networks of influence, loyalty, and obligation that don't show up clearly in legal codes or official records. Consider the role of the lady of the household in a wealthy Viking family. While her husband was away on trading voyages or raids that could last months or even years, she wasn't just managing domestic affairs. She was running what was essentially a small business empire. She supervised the work of dozens of slaves and free servants. She made decisions about crop planting and livestock breeding that could determine whether the family prospered or starved. She negotiated with neighbors, settled disputes, and maintained the political alliances that kept her family safe. When her husband returned, he might technically be the head of the household again, but he would be walking into a complex web of relationships and obligations that his wife had created and maintained. In practical terms, she often had more day-to-day power than he did, even if the law didn't recognize it. But this informal power came with a dark side that reveals the fourth major contradiction in Viking women's lives. The same society that allowed women to accumulate wealth and influence also created situations where they were uniquely vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Viking women could accumulate tremendous informal power, but that power made them targets in ways that would shock modern audiences. The more successful a woman became, the more dangerous her position became. This wasn't just about jealousy or social resentment. It was about the fundamental structure of Viking society itself. Here's what most people don't understand about Viking culture. Everything revolved around honor, and honor was a zero-sum game. If someone gained honor, someone else had to lose it. When a woman became wealthy or influential, she wasn't just succeeding personally. She was potentially threatening the honor of every man around her who felt he deserved that success more than she did. The sagas are filled with stories that seem confusing until you understand this dynamic. Take the story of Hallgerdur Höskuldsdottir from Njal's saga. She's described as incredibly beautiful and intelligent, capable of managing complex political alliances and accumulating significant wealth. But she's also portrayed as manipulative and dangerous, someone who brings destruction to everyone around her. Modern readers often interpret these stories as simple misogyny, examples of medieval writers who couldn't imagine powerful women as anything other than villains. But I think something more complex is happening here. These stories reflect a society that simultaneously admired female capability and feared it. Hallgerdur isn't punished for being weak or incompetent. She's punished for being too successful at playing the same games that men played. She accumulates wealth, builds political alliances, and uses strategic marriages to advance her family's interests. But when she does these things, she's described as scheming and manipulative. When men do the exact same things, they're described as cunning and strategic. This double standard created an impossible situation for ambitious Viking women. They could gain power, but they had to be incredibly careful about how they displayed it. Show too little ambition, and you'd be overlooked and marginalized. Show too much, and you'd be branded as dangerous and unnatural. The archaeological evidence suggests that some women navigated this contradiction brilliantly. At the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, archaeologists found two women buried together in a vessel that rivals anything built for male rulers. The ship was filled with incredibly elaborate grave goods, carved wooden carts, tapestries, household items made from precious metals, and even the skeletons of horses and dogs. One of these women was clearly of extremely high status. The other might have been a servant or slave who was sacrificed to accompany her mistress to the afterlife. But here's what's fascinating about this burial. It shows us a woman who achieved a level of wealth and power that allowed her to command the same burial honors as a king. But we have almost no written records about who she was or how she accumulated such influence. This pattern shows up repeatedly in the archaeological record. We find evidence of incredibly powerful women in the material culture, but their stories don't appear in the historical sources that were written primarily by men. It's as if there were two parallel power structures operating in Viking society. One was official and male-dominated, recorded in law codes and sagas. The other was informal and often female-centered, visible only in the archaeological evidence they left behind. The fifth contradiction involves marriage and family relationships. where Viking women experienced freedoms that were revolutionary for their time period, combined with constraints that could literally be deadly. This is where the gap between theory and practice becomes most apparent, and where we see how the same cultural values could both liberate and oppress women depending on the circumstances. Under Norse law, marriage was supposed to be a mutual agreement between families, with both the bride and groom having some say in the arrangement. A woman could legally refuse a marriage proposal, and there are records of fathers being required to pay compensation to suitors if their daughters rejected them without good reason. Once married, women retained control over their personal property and could request divorces for specific reasons like physical abuse, financial neglect, or their husband's impotence. These rights were extraordinary for medieval Europe. In most Christian kingdoms, marriage was considered a sacrament that couldn't be dissolved under any circumstances. Women became the legal property of their husbands and had no right to own property independently. The idea that a woman could simply declare her marriage over and walk away with her possessions was almost unthinkable. But here's where the Viking system reveals its darker side. While women theoretically had the right to refuse marriages and request divorces, exercising these rights could have devastating consequences. A woman who refused too many marriage proposals might be seen as damaging her family's honor and political prospects. A woman who divorced her husband without what the community considered sufficient justification could find herself completely ostracized. The sagas tell us about women who were killed by their own relatives for refusing arranged marriages that would have benefited the family politically or economically. In the Laxdæla saga, a woman named Gudrun is forced into multiple strategic marriages despite her personal preferences. And when she finally tries to assert control over her romantic life, it leads to a blood feud that destroys multiple families. What makes this even more complex is that Viking marriage wasn't just about individual relationships. It was a crucial tool for building political alliances, establishing trade partnerships, and preventing warfare between communities. When a woman refused a marriage, she wasn't just asserting personal autonomy, she was potentially undermining her family's survival strategy. This created situations where the same legal rights that were supposed to protect women actually made them more vulnerable. A woman who knew she could theoretically divorce an abusive husband might be less likely to seek help from her family when problems arose, because divorce carried such severe social consequences. A woman who had the legal right to refuse a marriage might face intense pressure and even violence from relatives who felt she was being selfish or irresponsible. The sixth contradiction takes us into the economic sphere, where Viking women achieved a level of commercial independence that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for centuries, while simultaneously being excluded from the formal institutions that controlled long-distance trade and international commerce. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Hedeby, Kaupang, and Birka shows us that women were active participants in Viking Age commerce at every level. We find female graves containing merchant scales, indicating these women were involved in weighing precious metals for trade. We find imported goods like silk from China, spices from India, and amber from the Baltic in women's graves across Scandinavia, suggesting they were part of international trading networks that spanned continents. Some of the most impressive evidence comes from the workshop areas of major trading centers. At Birka, archaeologists have found evidence of bead-making workshops that were clearly run by women. These weren't just simple craft operations. They were sophisticated manufacturing centers that produced luxury goods for export across the Viking world and beyond. The women running these workshops had to understand international markets, manage complex supply chains, and coordinate with traders who traveled thousands of miles. They needed to know which types of beads were fashionable in different regions, how to source raw materials from multiple continents, and how to time their production to meet the seasonal rhythms of Viking Age commerce. But here's what's remarkable about this evidence. While we can see clear proof that women were running substantial commercial operations, they're almost completely absent from the written sources that describe Viking Age trade. The merchant sagas focus almost exclusively on male traders and their adventures. The legal codes that govern commercial disputes rarely mention women as independent economic actors. This suggests that women were operating in a parallel economy that was largely invisible to the formal institutions of Viking society. They were accumulating wealth, building business relationships, and participating in international commerce. But they were doing it through informal networks that didn't require official recognition or legal documentation. This parallel economy might have been more important than the official one in many ways. While male merchants focused on high-risk, high-reward ventures like long-distance raiding and exploration, female merchants seem to have specialized in the steady, reliable trade that kept Viking communities supplied with everyday necessities and luxury goods. The evidence suggests that these women were often the ones who maintained trading relationships during the long periods when their male relatives were away on raids or exploration voyages. They were the ones who kept the commercial networks functioning when official diplomatic relations broke down between different regions. But this economic independence came with significant limitations. Women might run successful businesses, but they couldn't participate in the formal assemblies where commercial law was decided. They might accumulate substantial wealth, but they couldn't use that wealth to gain official political power. They might be essential to the functioning of the Viking economy, but their contributions were largely invisible in the historical record. The seventh and final contradiction reveals perhaps the most shocking aspect of Viking women's lives. They could wield influence that extended across continents and shaped the course of history, while simultaneously being vulnerable to forms of violence and exploitation that were considered completely acceptable by their society. This is where we need to talk about something that most popular portrayals of Viking culture completely ignore. Slavery was absolutely central to Viking society, and women were disproportionately affected by it in ways that created some of the most disturbing contradictions in Norse culture. Viking raids weren't just about stealing gold and silver. They were about capturing people who could be sold as slaves or put to work in Viking households. The majority of these slaves were women and children because they were easier to transport and less likely to escape or rebel than adult men. But here's where it gets complicated. While many Viking women were victims of this slave trade, others were active participants in it. Wealthy Viking women owned slaves, supervised their work, and profited from their labor. Some of the most powerful women in Viking society built their wealth and influence on the backs of enslaved people. The archaeological evidence shows us that elite Viking households often included dozens of slaves working in various capacities. Some were domestic servants who cooked, cleaned, and cared for children. Others were skilled craftspeople who produced goods for trade. Still others worked in agriculture, manufacturing, or other economic activities that generated wealth for their owners. Female slaves faced particular vulnerabilities that free women didn't have to worry about. They could be sexually exploited by their owners without any legal recourse. They could be killed or mutilated for minor infractions. They could be sold away from their children or forced to bear children who would also become slaves. But some female slaves could also achieve positions of influence that would have been impossible for them in their original societies. A slave woman who became the concubine of a powerful Viking leader might gain access to wealth and political influence that elevated her above many free women. Her children, while technically illegitimate, might inherit significant property and social status. This created a situation where the same Viking society that gave free women unprecedented legal rights also created systems of exploitation that were particularly brutal for enslaved women. A free Viking woman might divorce her husband and walk away with her property, while an enslaved woman in the same household had no rights whatsoever and could be treated as property herself. The contradictions don't end there. Some of the most powerful Viking women achieved their positions partly through their ability to manage and control enslaved people. The lady of a great household wasn't just managing free servants and family members. She was overseeing a complex hierarchy that included people who had been captured in raids, purchased in slave markets, or born into bondage. This means that when we talk about Viking women's power and independence, we have to acknowledge that much of it was built on systems of exploitation that would be completely unacceptable today. The same women who broke barriers and challenged gender norms were often participating in forms of oppression that were far more severe than anything they experienced themselves. The evidence suggests that this contradiction was recognized and discussed in Viking society itself. The sagas include stories of women who struggle with the moral implications of slavery, and there are examples of female characters who free their slaves or treat them with unusual kindness. But these examples are presented as exceptional, not as challenges to the basic system. What makes this even more complex is that the line between free and enslaved could be surprisingly fluid in Viking society. A free woman who was captured in a raid might become enslaved, but she could potentially buy or earn her freedom later. A slave woman might be freed by her owner and become a respected member of the community. Children born to slave mothers might be adopted by their fathers and gain legal rights. This fluidity meant that Viking women's relationship to power was constantly shifting and contextual. The same woman might experience both oppression and privilege depending on her circumstances, and those circumstances could change rapidly based on warfare, family politics, or economic conditions. Understanding these contradictions requires us to dig deeper into the psychological and cultural forces that created such a bizarre system. What we're really looking at isn't just historical curiosities about gender roles. We're seeing how entire civilizations can create frameworks where the same person exists in multiple realities simultaneously. The key to unraveling this mystery lies in understanding that Viking society wasn't built around consistent principles the way modern legal systems try to be. Instead, it was a patchwork of competing values, practical necessities, and ancient traditions that often directly contradicted each other. Honor, survival, family loyalty, individual capability, religious belief, and economic opportunity all pulled in different directions, creating a society where logical consistency was less important than practical functionality. Think about it this way. A Viking community needed women to be capable and independent when their men were away for months at a time. They needed women who could make crucial decisions, manage complex households, and defend their families if necessary. But they also needed women who would accept arranged marriages that strengthened political alliances, who would produce legitimate heirs, and who wouldn't challenge the basic power structures that kept society stable. The solution wasn't to create a coherent system that balanced these needs. Instead, Viking culture developed what we might call contextual power structures. A woman's rights and capabilities shifted dramatically, depending on the specific situation she found herself in. She might be a powerful decision-maker in one context and completely powerless in another, sometimes within the same day. This explains why the archaeological evidence and the written sources often tell such different stories about Viking women. The material culture shows us women who accumulated wealth, traveled internationally, and wielded significant influence. The sagas and law codes show us women who were constrained by male authority and social expectations. Both versions are true, because they're describing different aspects of the same complex reality. But there's something even more fascinating happening here that most historians miss entirely. The contradictions in Viking women's lives weren't just accidents or inconsistencies in the cultural system. In many cases, they were deliberate features that served specific social functions. Consider how the threat of losing power or status actually reinforced certain behaviors. A woman who knew she could lose her property rights if she behaved inappropriately had strong incentives to conform to social expectations. A woman who understood that her commercial success depended on maintaining good relationships with male traders had reasons to be diplomatic and strategic in her business dealings. At the same time, The possibility of gaining power and independence gave women incentives to develop skills and capabilities that benefited the entire community. A woman who might inherit significant property had reasons to learn about agriculture, trade, and household management. A woman who might need to defend her family had reasons to stay physically strong and learn about weapons. This created a system where women were simultaneously encouraged to be capable and constrained from using their capabilities too freely. It was a form of social control that was much more sophisticated than the simple oppression, because it gave women real stakes in maintaining the system, even when that system limited their freedom. The religious contradictions we discussed earlier reveal another layer of this complexity. The Valur weren't just excluded from political assemblies by accident. Their exclusion served a crucial function in maintaining the separation between different types of authority in Viking society. By keeping spiritual power separate from temporal power, Viking culture created a system of checks and balances that prevented any single person or group from accumulating too much influence. A king might be powerful in political and military affairs, but he still had to respect the religious authority of female seers. A Völva might have direct access to divine knowledge, but she couldn't use that access to override the practical decisions made by the community assembly. This separation also created opportunities for women to wield influence indirectly. A Völva who couldn't vote in the assembly could still shape political decisions by delivering prophecies that influenced how people voted. A woman who couldn't speak officially at legal proceedings could still affect the outcome by privately counseling the men who would speak for her. These indirect forms of power were often more flexible and durable than official authority. A man who held formal political office could lose that position if he made unpopular decisions or if political circumstances changed. But a woman who built influence through personal relationships, religious authority, or economic networks could maintain that influence even when formal power structures shifted. The marriage contradictions reveal yet another dimension of this system. The gap between legal rights and practical reality wasn't just about social pressure or family expectations. It was about the fundamental structure of Viking society, where individual choices always had to be balanced against collective needs. When a Viking woman exercised her legal right to refuse a marriage or request a divorce, she wasn't just making a personal decision. She was potentially disrupting carefully negotiated political alliances, trade relationships, and military partnerships that affected entire communities. The social pressure she faced wasn't just prejudice against female independence. It was genuine concern about the practical consequences of her choices. This created situations where women's legal rights functioned more like bargaining chips than absolute protections. A woman might threaten to refuse a marriage or request a divorce as a way of negotiating better terms for herself or her family. The legal framework gave her leverage in these negotiations, even if she couldn't always use that leverage without significant personal cost. The economic contradictions show us how this system played out in commercial contexts. Viking women weren't excluded from formal trade institutions because people believed they were incapable of handling complex business dealings. The archaeological evidence proves they were running sophisticated commercial operations. Instead, their exclusion served to maintain social stability by preventing economic power from translating directly into political power. By keeping female merchants operating in parallel networks rather than integrated institutions, Viking society could benefit from women's commercial skills without disrupting the male-dominated political hierarchy. Women could accumulate wealth and build business relationships, but they couldn't use that success to challenge the basic power structures of their communities. This parallel economy also created opportunities that wouldn't have existed in a more integrated system. Female merchants could operate with less oversight and regulation than their male counterparts. They could develop innovative business practices, explore new markets, and build relationships that crossed cultural and political boundaries more easily than men, whose activities were more closely monitored by formal institutions. The slavery contradictions reveal the darkest aspect of this system. but also the most important for understanding how it functioned psychologically. The fact that some Viking women could simultaneously experience oppression and participate in oppressing others created complex psychological dynamics that reinforced the entire system. A free Viking woman who owned slaves had concrete evidence that her status and privileges were valuable and worth protecting. She could see firsthand what happened to women who lacked legal protections and social standing. This created powerful incentives for her to accept the limitations on her own freedom in exchange for maintaining her position above enslaved women. At the same time, the possibility that circumstances could change rapidly meant that no woman's position was entirely secure. A free woman could become enslaved if her community was raided. A wealthy woman could lose her property if her family fell from political favor. This uncertainty created a society where everyone had reasons to maintain relationships and alliances that could provide protection if their circumstances changed. The fluidity between free and enslaved status also meant that the boundaries of the system were constantly being negotiated and renegotiated. Women who had experienced both freedom and enslavement brought unique perspectives to these negotiations. They understood both sides of the power dynamic in ways that shaped how the entire system evolved. What emerges from all of this is a picture of Viking society as an incredibly complex and sophisticated system for managing competing needs and values. It wasn't a society that prioritized individual rights or gender equality as we understand these concepts today. Instead, it was a society that prioritized survival, stability, and functionality in a harsh and unpredictable world. The contradictions in Viking women's lives weren't bugs in the system. They were features that allowed the society to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential social functions. By giving women real power in some contexts while constraining them in others, Viking culture created a flexible framework that could respond to different challenges without completely restructuring itself. This explains why Viking society was able to maintain its distinctive character across several centuries and vast geographical distances. The contradictions that seem so puzzling to modern observers actually provided the system with resilience and adaptability that more logically consistent societies might have lacked. But understanding this system also reveals something crucial about the women who navigated it successfully. They weren't passive victims of oppression, nor were they simply beneficiaries of unusual freedom. They were active agents who learned to work within and around a complex set of constraints and opportunities to achieve their goals and protect their interests. The most successful Viking women seem to have been those who understood the contradictions of their society and learned to use them strategically. They knew when to assert their rights and when to accept limitations. They understood how to build influence through informal networks while respecting the boundaries of formal institutions. They learned to navigate between different types of power and authority without triggering the defensive reactions that could destroy them. This strategic thinking shows up repeatedly in the archaeological evidence and the saga literature. The women who left the most impressive material remains weren't necessarily those who challenged the system most directly. Instead, they were often those who found creative ways to work within the system's contradictions to achieve unprecedented levels of wealth, influence, and independence. The woman buried in the Oseberg ship, for example, clearly achieved extraordinary status and power, but she did it in ways that didn't threaten the basic structure of male political authority. Her power was expressed through religious and cultural channels that complemented rather than competed with traditional masculine roles. Similarly, the female merchants whose graves contain evidence of international trade networks built their success by specializing in economic activities that were essential to Viking society, but not directly controlled by male-dominated institutions. They found niches where their capabilities were valued and their success didn't pose threats to established power structures. This pattern suggests that the contradictions in Viking women's lives weren't just imposed from outside. They were also actively created and maintained by women themselves as strategies for navigating a complex social environment. Women who understood how to balance capability with conformity, independence with cooperation, and ambition with discretion could achieve remarkable things within this system. The religious authority of the voleur provides perhaps the clearest example of this strategic thinking. These women claimed direct access to divine knowledge and used that claim to build influence that could rival or even exceed that of kings and jarls. But they exercised this influence in ways that complemented rather than challenged male political authority. A vulva who delivered prophecies that supported popular political decisions would see her reputation and influence grow. A vulva who consistently opposed the wishes of powerful men would likely find her authority questioned and her safety threatened. The most successful seers seem to have been those who understood how to use their religious authority to shape political outcomes without appearing to challenge the basic principle that temporal power belonged to men. This wasn't necessarily conscious manipulation or deception. Many of these women likely believed genuinely in their religious calling and their ability to communicate with the gods. But their success depended on their ability to exercise that calling in ways that worked within the constraints of their society rather than against them. The same pattern shows up in the economic sphere, where successful female merchants seem to have specialized in types of trade that were essential to Viking society, but not directly competitive with male-dominated activities. Rather than trying to break into the high-profile world of raiding and exploration, they focused on the steady, reliable commerce that kept communities supplied with necessities and luxury goods. This division of labor wasn't just imposed by male authorities. It was also a strategic choice by women who recognized that certain economic niches offered better opportunities for long-term success and security. A woman who built her wealth through reliable trade relationships was less vulnerable to the political and military upheavals that could destroy the fortunes of men who depended on raiding and warfare. The marriage and family contradictions reveal similar strategic thinking. Women who navigated these successfully seem to have been those who understood how to use their legal rights as bargaining chips rather than absolute protections. They knew when to assert their independence and when to accept family authority. They understood how to build personal relationships that gave them influence even when formal power was denied to them. This strategic approach to marriage and family relationships shows up clearly in the saga literature, where the most memorable female characters are often those who find creative ways to achieve their goals within the constraints of arranged marriages and patriarchal authority. They use their intelligence, social skills, and understanding of family dynamics to build influence and protect their interests, even when they can't directly control their circumstances. The slavery contradictions reveal the darkest aspects of this strategic thinking, but also some of the most important for understanding how the system functioned. Women who participated in slave ownership weren't just passively accepting a system they inherited. They were actively choosing to maintain their position within a hierarchy that oppressed other women. This choice reflected a realistic understanding of their options within the constraints of Viking society. A woman who refused to own slaves or participate in the exploitation of enslaved people wouldn't have changed the system. She would simply have made herself poorer and less influential without helping the women she was trying to protect. At the same time, some women seem to have found ways to participate in the slave system while minimizing its harmful effects. The saga literature includes examples of female slave owners who treated their enslaved people with unusual kindness, who freed slaves more readily than was typical, or who helped enslaved women improve their circumstances within the constraints of the system. These examples suggest that even within the most oppressive aspects of Viking society, individual women found ways to exercise moral agency and make choices that reflected their values while still protecting their own interests and security. Understanding this strategic approach to navigating contradictions helps us make sense of what might be the most puzzling aspect of Viking women's lives. How could the same culture that produced legendary shield maidens also create legal frameworks that treated women as property. How could a society that worshipped female goddesses and relied on female seers simultaneously exclude women from political assemblies? The answer lies in recognizing that Viking society didn't operate according to our modern concepts of logical consistency or universal principles. Instead, it was built around what we might call situational ethics, where the same person could occupy completely different positions in the social hierarchy depending on the specific context and circumstances they found themselves in. This situational approach to power and status created opportunities that wouldn't have existed in more rigid systems. But it also created vulnerabilities that could be devastating when circumstances changed. A woman who built her influence through religious authority could find that authority questioned if political conditions shifted. A woman who accumulated wealth through trade could lose everything if her family fell from favor or if her community was destroyed in warfare. The psychological impact of living within these contradictions must have been enormous. Imagine being a Viking woman who knew she could own property and run businesses, but also knew that her male relatives could kill her for refusing a marriage they considered advantageous. Imagine having the legal right to divorce your husband, but understanding that exercising that right could result in complete social ostracism and economic ruin. These contradictions created what psychologists today might recognize as a form of learned helplessness, where people internalize conflicting messages about their capabilities and worth. But they also created opportunities for exceptional individuals to find creative solutions that maximize their freedom within the constraints they faced. The women who thrived in Viking society seem to have been those who developed what we might call situational intelligence. They understood intuitively how to read social contexts and adjust their behavior accordingly. They knew when to assert themselves and when to defer. They understood how to build alliances that could protect them when their circumstances changed. This situational intelligence shows up most clearly in the saga literature, where successful female characters demonstrate an almost supernatural ability to navigate complex political and social situations. They seem to understand instinctively how different people will react to various approaches, and they adjust their strategies accordingly. Take the example of the Deep-Minded, who appears in several Icelandic sagas as one of the most powerful women of the Viking Age. After her husband and son were killed in battle, she took control of vast landholdings in Scotland and Ireland. When political conditions there became unstable, she organized a massive migration to Iceland, bringing with her an entire fleet of ships filled with family members, servants, and followers. Once in Iceland, didn't try to maintain formal political authority in the way a male leader might have. Instead, she used her control over land distribution to create a network of obligations and loyalties that gave her enormous influence over the developing Icelandic society. She arranged strategic marriages for her female relatives and followers, granted land to male supporters, and established herself as a kind of unofficial queen mother whose approval was essential for anyone seeking to gain status in the new colony. When died, she was buried with honors typically reserved for male rulers, and her descendants became some of the most powerful families in Icelandic history. But she achieved this remarkable legacy by working within the constraints of Viking gender roles rather than directly challenging them. She never claimed formal political titles or tried to participate in male-dominated institutions. Instead, she built parallel power structures that accomplished her goals while respecting the social boundaries that defined her society. This pattern of building parallel power structures appears repeatedly in the archaeological and literary evidence about successful Viking women. Rather than trying to break into male-dominated institutions, they created alternative networks that could achieve similar results through different means. The volur we discussed earlier provide another excellent example of this strategy. Rather than trying to gain formal political authority, they built religious institutions that gave them influence over the same decisions that political leaders controlled. They couldn't vote in assemblies, but they could deliver prophecies that influenced how other people voted. They couldn't make laws, but they could claim divine authority that trumped human legal systems. This parallel approach to power had several advantages over direct competition with male authority. It was less threatening to existing power structures, which meant it was less likely to provoke defensive reactions that could destroy the women attempting it. It allowed women to develop specialized expertise and build loyal followings in areas where they had natural advantages, and it created multiple pathways to influence, which made the overall system more resilient and adaptable. But this parallel approach also had significant limitations that help explain why Viking women's power remained constrained despite their remarkable achievements. Parallel power structures are always vulnerable to being marginalized or eliminated when they conflict with official institutions. They depend on social recognition and acceptance in ways that formal authority doesn't. And they often require constant negotiation and relationship maintenance that can be exhausting and precarious. The economic contradictions we've explored reveal how these parallel power structures functioned in practice. Female merchants created trading networks that operated alongside but separately from the male-dominated institutions that controlled long-distance raiding and exploration. They specialized in different types of goods, used different trade routes, and built relationships with different groups of customers and suppliers. This economic specialization allowed women to accumulate substantial wealth and influence without directly competing with male merchants for the same opportunities. But it also meant that female commercial success was always somewhat precarious, dependent on maintaining good relationships with the men who controlled the official trade institutions and political structures. The marriage and family contradictions show us how women navigated these challenges in their most intimate relationships. The legal rights that allowed women to refuse marriages and request divorces weren't just individual protections. They were bargaining tools that could be used to negotiate better terms within arranged marriages and family alliances. A woman who threatened to refuse a marriage could potentially extract concessions about how she would be treated within that marriage. A woman who had grounds for divorce could use that leverage to improve her situation without actually dissolving the marriage. The legal framework gave women options that they could use strategically, even if they couldn't always exercise those options without significant personal cost. This strategic use of legal rights helps explain why Viking women's formal protections were often more extensive than their practical freedom. The laws weren't necessarily intended to create individual autonomy as we understand it today. Instead, they were tools for managing family relationships and social obligations in ways that balanced competing interests and maintained social stability. The religious contradictions reveal another dimension of how women built and maintained parallel power structures. The Völur didn't just claim religious authority randomly, they built that authority through years of training, travel, and relationship building that created networks of supporters and clients across the Viking world. A successful Völva had to understand not just religious rituals and mythology, but also the political and social dynamics of the community she served. She needed to know which prophecies would be welcomed and which might be dangerous. She had to build relationships with powerful men who could protect her while maintaining her independence and credibility. The archaeological evidence suggests that some Völur achieved remarkable success at this balancing act. The ritual staffs and exotic grave goods found in female burials across Scandinavia indicate that these women were part of international networks that connected communities across vast distances. They were traveling, trading, and building relationships that crossed cultural and political boundaries. But the same evidence also shows us how precarious these positions could be. Female graves with ritual objects are often found in frontier areas or border regions where traditional social structures were less stable. This suggests that religious authority provided opportunities for women in situations where conventional power structures were disrupted or uncertain. The slavery contradictions reveal the darkest aspects of how these parallel power structures functioned but they also show us the limits of what individual agency could accomplish within the constraints of Viking society. Women who owned slaves weren't just passive participants in an oppressive system. They were actively making choices about how to exercise power over other people. Some of these choices reflected genuine moral reasoning about how to minimize harm within the constraints they faced. The saga literature includes examples of female slave owners who freed their slaves, who treated enslaved people as family members, or who used their authority to protect vulnerable people from abuse by others. But other choices reflected the same strategic thinking that we see in other aspects of Viking women's lives. Participating in slave ownership was often essential for maintaining social status and economic security. A woman who refused to own slaves would have made herself poorer and less influential without necessarily helping the people she was trying to protect. This moral complexity reveals something crucial about how Viking society functioned psychologically. The contradictions in women's lives weren't just abstract legal or social arrangements. They were lived experiences that required constant moral and practical decision-making under conditions of uncertainty and constraint. Every Viking woman had to navigate situations where her values, interests, and obligations pulled in different directions. She had to make choices about when to assert herself and when to accommodate others. She had to balance her personal desires against her family responsibilities and community expectations. These daily negotiations shaped not just individual lives, but the entire culture of Viking society. The way women navigated contradictions influenced how those contradictions evolved over time. Successful strategies were copied and adapted by others. Failed approaches were abandoned or modified. This evolutionary process helps explain why Viking gender roles were so different from those of other medieval European societies. The specific combination of environmental challenges, economic opportunities, and cultural traditions that shaped Scandinavian communities created unique pressures and possibilities that led to unique solutions. The harsh northern climate and scattered settlements meant that communities couldn't afford to waste human potential based on rigid gender roles. Women needed to be capable of managing complex responsibilities when men were away. But the warrior culture and honor-based social system also created pressures that constrained women's freedom and autonomy. The maritime economy that connected Scandinavia to trading networks across Europe and beyond created opportunities for women to participate in commercial activities that generated wealth and influence. But the same economy also created the slave trade that made women particularly vulnerable to violence and exploitation. The decentralized political structure of early Scandinavian societies created space for parallel power structures and informal authority that women could access. But the constant warfare and political instability that characterized the Viking Age also meant that women's positions were always potentially precarious. Understanding these environmental and cultural factors helps us see why the contradictions in Viking women's lives weren't just random inconsistencies. They were systematic responses to specific challenges that required balancing competing needs and values in ways that maximize survival and prosperity under difficult conditions. This systematic nature of the contradictions also explains why they persisted for so long and across such vast geographical areas. The basic challenges that created these contradictions didn't disappear quickly or easily. Communities that found successful ways to balance women's capabilities with social stability had advantages over communities that didn't. The archaeological evidence shows us that the most successful Viking settlements were often those that found effective ways to utilize women's skills and capabilities while maintaining social cohesion. The wealthiest graves, the most impressive buildings, and the most extensive trade networks are often associated with communities that seem to have developed sophisticated approaches to managing gender roles and power relationships. But this success came at enormous personal cost for the women who lived within these systems. The psychological stress of navigating constant contradictions, the physical dangers of operating in parallel power structures, and the moral complexity of participating in systems of oppression while seeking personal advancement must have been extraordinary. The saga literature gives us glimpses of this psychological reality through its portrayals of complex female characters who struggle with conflicting loyalties, competing desires, and impossible choices. These literary portraits probably reflect real experiences of women who lived within the contradictions we've been exploring. Modern readers often find these saga women frustrating because they don't behave according to our expectations about how oppressed people should respond to oppression. They don't rebel consistently against male authority. They don't reject the systems that constrain them. Instead, they navigate within those systems, sometimes successfully and sometimes tragically. But understanding the contradictions that shaped their lives helps us see that their responses were often rational and strategic given the constraints they faced. A woman who had the choice between accommodation and destruction would reasonably choose accommodation if it gave her better chances of protecting herself and the people she cared about. This doesn't mean we should romanticize or excuse the oppressive aspects of Viking society. The contradictions we've explored created genuine suffering and injustice that affected countless women's lives. The systems that constrained women's freedom were real and harmful, regardless of whether some women found ways to work within them successfully. But understanding how these contradictions functioned helps us recognize the agency and intelligence that women exercised, even within oppressive systems. It helps us see that the history of gender relations isn't just a simple story of oppression and liberation, but a complex process of negotiation, adaptation, and strategic thinking that continues to shape our world today. The legacy of Viking women's contradictory experiences extends far beyond medieval Scandinavia. The patterns we see in their lives, the strategies they developed for navigating competing demands, and the psychological frameworks they created for managing complex social positions continue to influence how people think about gender, power, and identity. Many of the contradictions that defined Viking women's lives persist in different forms in modern societies. Women today still navigate situations where they're expected to be capable and independent in some contexts, while accepting limitations and constraints in others. They still face pressure to balance personal ambitions with family responsibilities, to assert themselves without appearing threatening, and to participate in systems that may disadvantage other women. The strategic thinking that successful Viking women developed for managing these contradictions offers insights that remain relevant today. The importance of situational intelligence, the value of building parallel power structures, and the necessity of understanding how different types of authority function in different contexts are lessons that continue to matter. But perhaps the most important lesson from Viking women's experiences is the recognition that contradictions in social systems aren't just accidents or oversights. They're often deliberate features that serve specific functions, even when those functions create suffering and injustice for the people who must navigate them. Understanding this helps us recognize that changing oppressive systems requires more than just pointing out their inconsistencies or contradictions. It requires understanding why those contradictions exist, what functions they serve, and how to create alternative approaches that meet the same needs while reducing harm and increasing freedom. The story of Viking women reminds us that people throughout history have found ways to exercise agency and create meaning within even the most constraining circumstances. It shows us that the relationship between power and oppression is often more complex than simple narratives of dominance and resistance suggest, and it demonstrates that understanding the past requires us to grapple with complexity and contradiction, rather than seeking simple explanations or comfortable moral clarity. The Viking women whose lives we've explored were neither purely victims nor purely heroes. They were human beings navigating impossible situations with intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking that deserves our respect and understanding. Their experiences challenge us to think more deeply about our own assumptions regarding gender, power, and social change. They remind us that the work of creating more just and equitable societies requires not just moral conviction, but also strategic thinking, psychological insight, and deep understanding of how complex systems actually function in practice. As we continue to uncover more archaeological evidence and develop better analytical tools for understanding the past, our picture of Viking women's lives will undoubtedly continue to evolve. New discoveries may reveal aspects of their experiences that we haven't yet recognized. New theoretical frameworks may help us understand the contradictions they faced in ways that we haven't yet imagined. But the fundamental lesson of their story will remain constant. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures who can find ways to create meaning, build relationships, and exercise agency even within systems that seem designed to prevent them from doing so. The specific contradictions that Viking women navigated may be unique to their time and place, but the human capacity for resilience, intelligence, and strategic thinking that they demonstrated is universal. This capacity gives us hope for addressing the contradictions and injustices that persist in our own societies. If Viking women could find ways to build parallel power structures, navigate situational constraints, and create spaces for agency within oppressive systems, then we too can find ways to work toward more just and equitable arrangements that honor human dignity while acknowledging the complexity of social change. The story of why Viking women were both feared and oppressed isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a window into the fundamental challenges of human social organization and the remarkable creativity that people bring to navigating those challenges. Understanding their experiences helps us better understand our own possibilities and responsibilities as we work to create societies that balance individual freedom with collective needs, that honor human capability while maintaining social stability, and that acknowledge the complexity of power while working toward justice. The question that emerges from all of this is whether Viking women actually understood the contradictory nature of their own position, or if they simply accepted it as the natural order of things. The evidence suggests something far more sophisticated was happening. These women weren't passive victims of a confusing system. They were active participants who developed what we might call a dual consciousness about their place in society. Archaeological findings from female graves across Scandinavia reveal objects that tell a fascinating story about how women viewed themselves. We find weapons buried alongside domestic tools, religious artifacts mixed with commercial equipment, and luxury items from distant lands placed next to simple household goods. These grave assemblages suggest women who saw themselves as occupying multiple roles simultaneously. But here's what makes this even more intriguing. The way these objects are arranged in burials often follows patterns that seem deliberately symbolic. A sword might be placed across a loom, suggesting a woman who saw herself as both warrior and weaver. Merchant scales might be buried alongside ritual staffs, indicating someone who combined commercial and religious authority. These burial patterns weren't random or accidental. They represent conscious choices about how these women wanted to be remembered and what aspects of their identity they considered most important. The fact that they chose to emphasize multiple, sometimes contradictory roles suggests they understood perfectly well that their lives didn't fit into simple categories. This dual consciousness shows up even more clearly in the saga literature, where female characters often demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the systems they're operating within. They don't just react to constraints, they analyze them, understand their logic, and develop strategies for working within them while pursuing their own goals. Take the example of Bergthora from Njal's saga. She's married to one of the most respected legal experts in Iceland, but she repeatedly takes actions that undermine his efforts to maintain peace and stability. She kills his enemies' servants, she insults their wives, and she generally behaves in ways that escalate conflicts rather than resolving them. Modern readers often interpret Bergthora as simply destructive or irrational. But if you look closely at her actions, a different pattern emerges. Every time she escalates a conflict, she does so in ways that force her husband to take stronger positions in defense of their family's honor. She uses her understanding of how the honor system works to manipulate situations so that her husband has to become more aggressive and assertive than his natural temperament would prefer. This isn't mindless violence or emotional instability. It's strategic thinking based on a sophisticated understanding of how power operates in her society. Bergthora recognizes that her husband's reputation for fairness and moderation, while admirable in many ways, could be exploited by enemies who might see him as weak or indecisive. By forcing him into situations where he has to demonstrate strength and resolve, she's actually protecting their family's long-term interests. But she also understands that she can't achieve this goal directly. If she openly criticized her husband's approach or tried to give him political advice, it would undermine his authority and damage their family's reputation. Instead, she uses her position as a wife to create situations that achieve her strategic objectives while maintaining plausible deniability about her real intentions. This kind of sophisticated maneuvering appears repeatedly in the saga literature, suggesting that Viking women developed highly refined skills for indirect influence and strategic manipulation. They understood that they couldn't exercise power in the same ways men could, so they developed alternative approaches that could be equally effective under the right circumstances. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Female graves from high-status Viking burials often contain objects that suggest women who were deeply involved in political and military decision-making, even if they couldn't participate in those processes officially. We find military equipment in women's graves, but it's often arranged in ways that suggest ceremonial or advisory roles, rather than direct combat participation. Similarly, we find evidence of women who were clearly involved in long-distance trade and diplomacy, but who operated through networks and relationships that complemented, rather than competed with male-dominated institutions. These women weren't trying to replace male authority. They were trying to influence and shape it through indirect means. This strategic approach to power had profound implications for how Viking society functioned as a whole. By creating parallel systems of female influence that operated alongside official male authority, Viking communities developed remarkably resilient and adaptable power structures that could respond to changing circumstances without completely disrupting social stability. When male leaders were killed in battle or lost in overseas expeditions, women who had been building influence through informal networks could step in to maintain continuity and prevent complete social collapse. When communities faced new challenges that required different types of expertise or relationships, women who had been developing specialized knowledge and connections could provide solutions that wouldn't have been available through official channels alone. This system of parallel authority helps explain why Viking society was able to maintain its distinctive character across such vast geographical and temporal ranges. The flexibility and redundancy built into the power structure through female participation made the entire system more robust and adaptable than societies that relied exclusively on formal male authority. But this resilience came at enormous personal cost for the women who made it possible. Operating in parallel power structures required constant vigilance, sophisticated social skills, and the ability to navigate complex relationships without official recognition or protection. Women who miscalculated or pushed too hard could face devastating consequences, while those who were too passive could find themselves marginalized and powerless. The psychological pressure of maintaining this balance shows up in the saga literature through portrayals of women who seem to be constantly calculating and strategizing about their relationships and actions. These literary characters often appear manipulative or scheming to modern readers, but they're actually reflecting the reality of what it took to exercise influence within the constraints of Viking social systems. The religious contradictions we explored earlier take on new significance when viewed through this lens of strategic consciousness. The volur, weren't just claiming divine authority randomly. They were building religious institutions that could provide alternative sources of legitimacy and influence when formal political channels were closed to them. But they also understood that religious authority had to be exercised carefully to avoid provoking defensive reactions from male political leaders. A vulva who consistently delivered prophecies that contradicted popular political decisions would quickly lose credibility and influence. Success required understanding how to use religious authority to shape political outcomes while maintaining the appearance of spiritual neutrality. The evidence suggests that successful voleurs developed sophisticated approaches to this challenge. They built networks of supporters and informants that kept them informed about political developments. They cultivated relationships with powerful men who could protect them and help amplify their influence. And they learned to frame their prophecies in ways that appeared to come from divine inspiration, while actually reflecting careful analysis of political and social dynamics. This strategic approach to religious authority created opportunities for women to influence events across vast geographical ranges. A respected vulva could travel from community to community, building relationships and gathering information that allowed her to understand regional political patterns and economic trends. She could use this knowledge to deliver prophecies that helped communities make better decisions while building her own reputation and influence. The archaeological evidence shows us Valour graves that contain objects from across the known world, suggesting these women were part of international networks that connected communities across cultural and political boundaries. They weren't just local religious figures. They were sophisticated political and economic actors who used religious authority as a platform for much broader forms of influence. The marriage and family contradictions reveal another dimension of this strategic consciousness. Viking women who successfully navigated marriage and family relationships seem to have understood that legal rights were tools for negotiation rather than absolute protections. They used the possibility of refusing marriages or requesting divorces as leverage for improving their situations within existing relationships. This strategic approach to marriage helps explain why Viking women's legal rights were more extensive than their practical freedom. The laws weren't necessarily intended to create individual autonomy. Instead, they were mechanisms for managing family relationships and social obligations in ways that gave women bargaining power while maintaining overall social stability. But using legal rights strategically required sophisticated understanding of family dynamics, political relationships, and economic circumstances. A woman who threatened divorce without understanding the broader implications could find herself worse off than before. A woman who refused a marriage proposal without considering the political consequences could damage not just her own prospects, but her entire family's position. The saga literature provides numerous examples of women who navigated these challenges successfully by developing deep understanding of the systems they were operating within. They learned to read social and political situations, to anticipate how different people would react to various approaches, and to time their actions for maximum effectiveness with minimum risk. This strategic intelligence wasn't something that came naturally or easily. It required years of observation, learning, and practice to develop the skills needed to operate effectively within Viking social systems. The women who achieved the most impressive results seem to have been those who started learning these skills early and continued refining them throughout their lives. The economic contradictions show us how this strategic thinking played out in commercial contexts. Female merchants who built successful businesses seem to have understood that they needed to specialize in areas where their capabilities were valued, but where they weren't directly competing with male-dominated institutions for the same opportunities. Rather than trying to break into the high-profile world of raiding and exploration, successful female merchants focused on the steady, reliable trade that kept communities supplied with necessities and luxury goods. They built relationships with suppliers and customers that were based on trust, reliability, and specialized knowledge rather than on military prowess or political connections. This economic specialization allowed women to accumulate substantial wealth while avoiding direct confrontation with male authority. But it also required sophisticated understanding of market dynamics, cultural preferences, and political relationships across vast geographical ranges. A successful female merchant had to understand what goods were valued in different regions, how to navigate cultural differences between trading partners, and how to maintain business relationships across political boundaries and military conflicts. The archaeological evidence shows us female merchants who were clearly operating at international levels, with grave goods that demonstrate connections to trading networks spanning from Greenland to Constantinople. These women weren't just local crafters or shopkeepers. They were sophisticated business operators who understood global market dynamics and cultural trends. But their success depended on their ability to operate within the constraints of their social position, while building the relationships and expertise needed for international commerce. This required not just business skills, but also diplomatic abilities, cultural sensitivity, and strategic thinking about how to maintain their operations when political circumstances changed. The slavery contradictions reveal perhaps the most complex aspects of this strategic consciousness. Viking women who owned slaves weren't just passively participating in an inherited system. They were making active choices about how to exercise power over other people, and these choices reflected sophisticated moral and strategic reasoning. Some women seem to have approached slave ownership as a necessary evil that had to be managed in ways that minimized harm while maintaining their own security and status. The saga literature includes examples of female slave owners who treated enslaved people with unusual kindness, who provided opportunities for enslaved people to improve their circumstances, or who freed slaves more readily than was typical. These approaches weren't just expressions of personal compassion, though compassion may have played a role. They were also strategic choices based on understanding that treating enslaved people well could create loyalty and cooperation that made household management more effective and less dangerous. But other women seem to have used slave ownership as a tool for building status and influence within their communities. Owning large numbers of slaves demonstrated wealth and power. Using enslaved people for productive activities could generate additional wealth that could be reinvested in other forms of influence and security. This strategic approach to slave ownership created moral complexities that must have been psychologically challenging for the women involved. How do you maintain your humanity while participating in systems that dehumanize other people? How do you reconcile caring for your family and community with exploiting people who have their own families and communities? The saga literature suggests that some women struggled genuinely with these moral contradictions. We find examples of female characters who express guilt or ambivalence about their treatment of enslaved people, who make efforts to ameliorate the conditions of slavery even while participating in the system, or who eventually choose to free their slaves despite the economic costs involved. These literary portrayals probably reflect real psychological struggles experienced by women who had to navigate the moral complexities of slave ownership while maintaining their positions within Viking society. They show us people who were trying to find ways to exercise moral agency within systems that severely constrain their choices. But they also show us the limits of what individual moral reasoning could accomplish within the constraints of Viking social structures. A woman who refused to participate in slave ownership wouldn't have changed the system. She would simply have made herself poorer and less influential without helping the people she was trying to protect. This recognition that individual choices couldn't transform systemic problems seems to have led some Viking women to focus on finding ways to exercise moral agency within the constraints they faced, rather than trying to challenge those constraints directly. They looked for opportunities to treat people with dignity and compassion even within oppressive systems. They tried to use their influence to protect vulnerable people when possible. and they made choices that reflected their values, even when those choices couldn't eliminate the fundamental injustices they were operating within. This approach to moral agency within systemic constraints offers insights that remain relevant today. Many people face situations where they have to participate in systems they consider morally problematic, while looking for ways to minimize harm and exercise positive influence within those constraints. The strategic consciousness that Viking women developed for navigating these moral complexities involved understanding the difference between what they could control and what they couldn't, focusing their energy on areas where they could make positive differences, and accepting that perfect moral purity wasn't possible within the systems they inherited. This didn't mean abandoning moral reasoning or accepting injustice passively. Instead, it meant developing sophisticated approaches to moral decision-making that took account of systemic constraints, while still trying to act in ways that reflected personal values and contributed to positive change where possible. The legacy of this strategic consciousness extends far beyond Viking Age Scandinavia. The approaches that Viking women developed for navigating contradictory social systems, building parallel power structures, and exercising moral agency within constraints continue to influence how people think about social change and individual responsibility. Many of the strategies we see in Viking women's lives appear in other contexts where people face similar challenges. The use of indirect influence when direct authority is unavailable. The development of specialized expertise that creates opportunities for influence and independence. The strategic use of legal rights as bargaining tools rather than absolute protections. The building of networks and relationships that can provide alternative sources of power and security. These strategies remain relevant because the fundamental challenge they address hasn't disappeared. People throughout history and across cultures have faced situations where they need to navigate between competing demands, exercise influence within constraining systems, and make moral choices under conditions of uncertainty and limited options. The specific contradictions that Viking women faced were unique to their time and place, but the psychological and strategic frameworks they developed for managing those contradictions offer insights that transcend their particular historical context. They show us how human intelligence and creativity can find ways to create meaning and agency, even within the most constraining circumstances. Understanding these frameworks also helps us recognize the complexity and sophistication of people who lived in historical periods that we might otherwise dismiss as primitive or backward. Viking women weren't just victims of oppressive systems or beneficiaries of unusual freedoms. They were strategic actors who developed remarkable skills for navigating complex social environments and achieving their goals within significant constraints. This recognition challenges us to approach historical study with greater humility and sophistication. Instead of judging past societies by contemporary standards or looking for simple narratives of progress or decline, we need to develop better tools for understanding how people in different times and places created meaning and exercised agency within their particular circumstances. The story of Viking women also reminds us that social change is often more complex and gradual than dramatic narratives of revolution or liberation suggest. The contradictions these women navigated didn't disappear overnight or through single dramatic events. Instead, they evolved slowly as individual choices and strategic adaptations accumulated over generations to create new possibilities and constraints. This evolutionary approach to social change suggests that understanding how systems transform requires attention to the daily negotiations and strategic choices that ordinary people make within existing constraints. Large-scale social transformations often begin with individuals finding new ways to navigate existing systems, rather than with direct challenges to those systems. The strategic consciousness that Viking women developed for managing contradictions offers a model for thinking about how individual agency can contribute to broader social change, even when direct challenge to oppressive systems isn't possible or effective. By understanding how systems work, developing alternative approaches to achieving goals, and building networks of relationships and influence, individuals can create opportunities for change that might not be visible through more dramatic forms of resistance. But this approach also requires acknowledging the psychological and moral costs that people pay when they have to navigate contradictory systems over extended periods. The strategic thinking that enabled Viking women to achieve remarkable things within constraining circumstances also required them to accept compromises and limitations that must have been personally difficult and morally challenging. Recognizing these costs helps us appreciate the courage and intelligence that people throughout history have brought to navigating impossible situations. It also reminds us that creating more just and equitable societies requires not just moral conviction, but also strategic thinking about how to work within existing constraints while building foundations for future change. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new aspects of how Viking women navigated these challenges. Recent discoveries have uncovered female graves with increasingly diverse and sophisticated grave goods, suggesting that our understanding of women's roles and capabilities in Viking society is still evolving. New analytical techniques are also providing insights into aspects of Viking women's lives that weren't previously accessible through traditional archaeological and literary sources. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains is revealing patterns of migration and mobility that show women traveling much more extensively than previously thought. DNA analysis is uncovering family relationships and population dynamics that complicate our understanding of how Viking societies were organized. These new discoveries consistently reveal greater complexity and sophistication in Viking women's lives than earlier scholarship recognized. They show us women who were more mobile, more economically active, and more politically influential than traditional narratives suggested. But they also reveal the constraints and contradictions that shape these women's experiences in ways that are consistent with the patterns we've been exploring. The continuing evolution of our understanding of Viking women's lives reminds us that historical knowledge is always provisional and subject to revision based on new evidence and analytical approaches. The story we've been telling about the contradictions these women faced will undoubtedly continue to evolve as new discoveries provide additional insights into their experiences. But the fundamental recognition that these women were strategic actors who developed sophisticated approaches to navigating complex social systems seems likely to remain central to our understanding of their lives. The evidence consistently points to women who understood their circumstances clearly, who developed creative strategies for achieving their goals within significant constraints, and who exercised moral agency in ways that reflected both practical wisdom and personal values. This recognition of Viking women's strategic consciousness and sophisticated agency offers important lessons for understanding human adaptability and creativity more generally. It shows us how people can find ways to create meaning and exercise influence even within systems that seem designed to prevent them from doing so. The specific strategies that Viking women developed may not be directly applicable to contemporary situations, but the underlying principles they represent remain relevant. The importance of understanding how systems actually work rather than how they're supposed to work. The value of developing alternative approaches when direct methods aren't available. The necessity of building relationships and networks that can provide support and opportunities. The recognition that moral agency often requires working within imperfect systems, while looking for opportunities to improve them incrementally. These principles continue to guide people who face similar challenges in contemporary contexts. Understanding how Viking women applied these principles in their particular circumstances can provide insights and inspiration for people who are trying to navigate their own contradictory and constraining social systems. The story of why Viking women were both feared and oppressed ultimately reveals something fundamental about human societies and the people who live within them. It shows us that social systems are always more complex than they appear on the surface, that individual experiences within those systems are often contradictory and multifaceted, and that people possess remarkable capacities for strategic thinking and moral reasoning, even under the most challenging circumstances. These insights challenge us to approach both historical study and contemporary social analysis with greater sophistication and humility. They remind us that understanding how societies function requires attention to the lived experiences of the people within them, not just the formal structures and official narratives that often dominate historical accounts. And they demonstrate that human agency and creativity persist even within the most constraining circumstances, offering hope and guidance for people who face their own impossible contradictions and systemic challenges. The Viking women, whose stories we've explored, may have lived more than 1,000 years ago, but their experiences continue to offer valuable lessons about resilience, strategic thinking, and the persistent human capacity to create meaning and exercise agency, regardless of external constraints. The question that emerges from understanding this strategic consciousness is whether modern scholarship has been asking the right questions about Viking women's experiences. For decades, historians focused on whether Viking women were oppressed or liberated, as if these were mutually exclusive categories. But the evidence we've explored suggests that this binary thinking completely misses the point. Viking women weren't living in a world where oppression and liberation were opposite ends of a spectrum. They were living in a world where both conditions could exist simultaneously, sometimes within the same relationship or even the same conversation. A woman could be economically independent and legally constrained, religiously powerful and politically voiceless, socially respected and physically vulnerable, all at the same time. This simultaneous existence of contradictory conditions created what we might call a state of permanent negotiation. Every interaction, every decision, every relationship required constant calibration and recalibration based on shifting circumstances and competing demands. Viking women didn't just adapt to their social environment, they actively shaped it through countless daily choices about how to navigate impossible situations. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A wealthy Viking woman waking up in the morning didn't just think about what tasks needed to be accomplished that day. She had to consider which version of herself she needed to be in each situation she would encounter. When meeting with her household servants, she needed to project authority and competence. When greeting male neighbors, she might need to demonstrate appropriate deference while still protecting her interests. When consulting with a vulva about family decisions, she might need to show respect for spiritual authority while maintaining her own dignity and influence. This constant code switching required enormous psychological energy and sophisticated social intelligence. It also created opportunities for women who mastered these skills to exercise influence in ways that wouldn't have been possible in more rigid social systems. A woman who understood how to present herself differently in different contexts could access multiple forms of power and authority that were theoretically separate but practically interconnected. The archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking women became extraordinarily skilled at this kind of strategic self-presentation. We find female graves that contain objects representing multiple, sometimes contradictory social roles, arranged in ways that seem deliberately symbolic. These burial assemblages tell stories about women who saw themselves as complex, multifaceted individuals who couldn't be reduced to single categories or simple explanations. But mastering this kind of strategic complexity came with significant psychological costs that we're only beginning to understand. Living in a state of permanent negotiation meant that Viking women could never fully relax into a single, stable identity. They always had to be alert to shifting social dynamics and ready to adjust their behavior accordingly. The saga literature provides glimpses of this psychological reality through its portrayals of women who seem to be constantly calculating and strategizing about their relationships and actions. These literary characters often appear exhausting to modern readers because they never seem to just be themselves. They're always performing some version of themselves that's appropriate to their current circumstances. But this performance wasn't necessarily inauthentic or manipulative in the way we might assume. Instead, It reflected a sophisticated understanding that identity itself is contextual and relational. Viking women understood intuitively what modern psychologists have discovered through research: that we all have multiple selves that emerge in different social contexts, and that successful social functioning requires the ability to access the appropriate self for each situation. The difference was that Viking women had to manage much more dramatic shifts between these different selves than most people in more stable social systems. The gap between the self, who could own property and run businesses, and the self, who could be sold into marriage without consent, was enormous. Bridging that gap required psychological skills that most people never have to develop. This psychological complexity helps explain why Viking women's stories often seem so confusing or contradictory to modern audiences. We're used to thinking about historical figures as having consistent personalities and clear motivations. But Viking women were operating in social environments that required them to embody multiple, sometimes contradictory personalities, depending on the circumstances they faced. The religious contradictions take on new significance when viewed through this psychological lens. The Volur weren't just claiming divine authority as a career choice. They were accessing a form of identity that allowed them to transcend some of the contradictions that constrained other women. When a Volva spoke as a representative of the gods, she could temporarily step outside the normal social hierarchies that limited female authority. But this transcendence was always temporary and contextual. A Volva who delivered prophecies with divine authority might have to resume a more conventional female role as soon as the religious ceremony ended. She had to understand not just how to access spiritual authority, but also how to transition back to ordinary social interactions without losing credibility or creating confusion about her status. The archaeological evidence shows us Volur graves that contain both ritual objects and domestic items, suggesting women who successfully navigated these transitions throughout their lives. They weren't just religious specialists. They were women who learned to use religious authority as one tool among many for managing the contradictions of their social position. The marriage and family contradictions reveal another dimension of this psychological complexity. Viking women who successfully managed family relationships had to develop what we might call emotional intelligence about power dynamics. They needed to understand not just their own feelings and motivations, but also how those feelings intersected with family honor, economic necessities, and political obligations. A Viking woman considering whether to refuse a marriage proposal couldn't just think about her personal preferences. She had to understand how her decision would affect her family's political alliances, economic prospects, and social standing. She needed to anticipate how different family members would react, and how those reactions might cascade through extended networks of relationships and obligations. This kind of emotional intelligence required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. It also required the ability to manage her own emotions in ways that served her strategic objectives, rather than just expressing her immediate feelings. A woman who let anger or disappointment drive her decisions could find herself in situations where those emotions created more problems than they solved. The saga literature provides numerous examples of women who demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence in managing family relationships. They understood how to use displays of emotion strategically, how to build coalitions among family members with competing interests, and how to navigate between their own desires and their obligations to others. But this emotional labor was often invisible and unrecognized by the formal structures of Viking society. A woman might spend years carefully managing family relationships to prevent conflicts that could destroy everyone's prosperity and security, but her contributions wouldn't appear in legal records or historical accounts. Her success would be measured by things that didn't happen, rather than by dramatic achievements that could be easily documented. The economic contradictions show us how this psychological complexity played out in commercial contexts. Female merchants who built successful businesses had to develop sophisticated understanding of cultural psychology across different regions and trading partners. They needed to know not just what goods people wanted, but also how to present themselves and their merchandise in ways that would be appealing to customers. from very different cultural backgrounds. A Viking woman trading with Byzantine merchants needed to understand not just the economic value of different goods, but also the social and cultural meanings those goods carried in Byzantine society. She needed to know how to behave in ways that would build trust and respect with trading partners, who might have very different expectations about appropriate female behavior. This cultural intelligence required extensive learning and careful observation of social dynamics across multiple societies. It also required the psychological flexibility to adapt her self-presentation to different cultural contexts without losing her sense of personal identity or compromising her core interests. The archaeological evidence shows us female merchants who were clearly operating across vast cultural distances, with grave goods that demonstrate connections to trading networks spanning from Ireland to Central Asia. These women weren't just exchanging goods, they were navigating complex cultural negotiations that required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The slavery contradictions reveal perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspects of Viking women's experiences. Women who owned slaves had to develop ways of thinking about human relationships that allowed them to maintain their humanity while participating in systems that dehumanized other people. Some women seem to have approached this challenge by developing what we might call compartmentalized thinking about different categories of people. They could maintain caring, respectful relationships with family members and free associates, while treating enslaved people as property to be managed, rather than as full human beings deserving of moral consideration. This compartmentalization wasn't necessarily conscious or deliberate. It might have been a psychological defense mechanism that allowed women to function within systems they couldn't change without being overwhelmed by guilt or moral distress. But it also enabled them to participate in forms of exploitation that caused enormous suffering for the people they owned. Other women seem to have struggled more directly with the moral contradictions of slave ownership. The saga literature includes examples of female characters who express ambivalence about their treatment of enslaved people, who make efforts to ameliorate the conditions of slavery, or who eventually choose to free their slaves despite the economic and social costs involved. These examples suggest that some Viking women maintained moral sensitivity about the humanity of enslaved people, even while participating in systems that denied that humanity. They found ways to exercise compassion and moral agency within constraints that severely limited their options for expressing those values. But the psychological cost of maintaining this moral sensitivity while participating in oppressive systems must have been enormous. How do you reconcile caring about human dignity with owning other human beings? How do you maintain your sense of moral integrity while benefiting from systems that deny moral consideration to entire categories of people? The saga literature suggests that some women dealt with these contradictions by focusing on small acts of kindness and compassion that didn't challenge the basic system, but provided opportunities for moral expression within it. They might treat their slaves with unusual consideration, provide better food and housing than was typical, or refrain from the most brutal forms of punishment and exploitation. These approaches allowed women to maintain some sense of moral agency without confronting the fundamental injustices of the systems they were operating within. But they also illustrate the limitations of individual moral reasoning when faced with systemic problems that require collective action to address. The psychological frameworks that Viking women developed for managing these moral contradictions offer insights that remain relevant for people facing similar dilemmas today. Many people find themselves participating in systems they consider morally problematic, while looking for ways to exercise positive influence within those constraints. The approaches that seem to have been most successful for Viking women involved understanding the difference between what they could control and what they couldn't, focusing their moral energy on areas where they could make positive differences, and accepting that perfect moral purity wasn't possible within the systems they inherited. This didn't mean abandoning moral reasoning or accepting injustice passively. Instead, It meant developing sophisticated approaches to moral decision-making that took account of systemic constraints while still trying to act in ways that reflected personal values and contributed to positive change where possible. The legacy of these psychological frameworks extends far beyond Viking Age Scandinavia. The mental strategies that Viking women developed for managing contradictory social positions, navigating complex power dynamics, and exercising moral agency within constraints continue to influence how people think about identity, relationships, and social responsibility. Many of the psychological challenges that Viking women faced persist in different forms in contemporary societies. People today still navigate situations where they're expected to embody different versions of themselves in different contexts. They still face pressure to balance personal desires with family obligations, individual ambitions with collective responsibilities, and moral convictions with practical necessities. The strategic consciousness that Viking women developed for managing these challenges involved sophisticated understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and moral reasoning that remains relevant for people facing similar dilemmas today. Their experiences offer insights into how people can maintain their sense of identity and agency, even when operating within systems that seem designed to prevent them from doing so. But understanding these psychological frameworks also requires acknowledging the enormous costs that people pay when they have to navigate contradictory systems over extended periods. The mental energy required for constant strategic thinking, the emotional labor of managing complex relationships, and the moral stress of participating in imperfect systems can be overwhelming even for people with remarkable intelligence and resilience. The archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking women thrived within these challenging circumstances, developing skills and achieving successes that were remarkable by any standard. But the same evidence also shows us women whose lives were shaped by trauma, conflict, and premature death that reflected the dangers and difficulties of their social environment. Recent advances in bioarchaeology are providing new insights into the physical and psychological impacts of the stresses that Viking women faced. Analysis of skeletal remains is revealing patterns of injury, disease, and nutritional stress that reflect the challenges of their daily lives. Chemical analysis of bones and teeth is showing evidence of migration, dietary changes, and environmental stresses that shape their experiences. These biological markers are helping us understand that the strategic consciousness and psychological resilience that enabled some Viking women to achieve remarkable things came at significant personal costs that aren't always visible in the archaeological or literary record. The women who successfully navigated the contradictions of their society were often those who paid high prices in terms of physical health, emotional well-being, and personal relationships. This recognition helps us appreciate the courage and determination that these women brought to managing impossible situations. It also reminds us that celebrating their achievements shouldn't obscure the fact that they were operating within systems that created unnecessary suffering and constrained human potential in ways that we should continue to work to address. The story of Viking women's psychological strategies for managing contradictory social positions offers both inspiration and warning for people facing similar challenges today. Their experiences demonstrate the remarkable capacity of human intelligence and creativity to find ways of exercising agency and creating meaning, even within the most constraining circumstances. But their experiences also illustrate the costs of systems that require people to navigate constant contradictions and competing demands without providing stable foundations for identity and relationships. Understanding these costs can help us recognize the importance of working towards social arrangements that honor human complexity while providing greater consistency and support for individual flourishing. The continuing discovery of new archaeological evidence about Viking women's lives suggests that our understanding of their psychological experiences will continue to evolve. Each new grave excavation, each new analysis of existing materials, and each new theoretical framework for interpreting the evidence provides additional insights into how these women understood themselves and their circumstances. But the fundamental recognition that Viking women were sophisticated psychological actors who developed complex strategies for managing contradictory social positions seems likely to remain central to our understanding of their experiences. The evidence consistently points to women who understood their circumstances clearly, who developed creative approaches to achieving their goals within significant constraints, and who exercised remarkable intelligence and resilience in navigating impossible situations. This recognition challenges us to approach the study of historical gender relations with greater sophistication and nuance. Instead of looking for simple narratives of oppression or liberation, we need to develop better tools for understanding how people in different times and places created meaning and exercised agency within their particular circumstances. The psychological frameworks that Viking women developed for managing contradictions also offer insights that extend beyond historical study into contemporary questions about identity, power, and social change. Their experiences remind us that human psychology is remarkably adaptable and that people can develop sophisticated strategies for maintaining their humanity and agency, even within systems that seem designed to prevent them from doing so. Understanding how Viking women navigated their contradictory circumstances can provide guidance and inspiration for people who face their own impossible situations and competing demands. The specific strategies they developed may not be directly applicable to contemporary contexts, but the underlying principles they represent continue to offer valuable insights into human resilience and the persistent capacity for strategic thinking and moral reasoning regardless of external constraints. The question that emerges from all of this is what lessons we can draw from Viking women's experiences for understanding our own psychological and social challenges. Their story reminds us that contradiction and complexity are often permanent features of human social systems, rather than problems that can be easily solved through individual effort or social reform. Learning to navigate these contradictions effectively requires developing psychological skills and strategic intelligence that can help us maintain our sense of identity and agency while working within imperfect systems toward gradual improvement and positive change. The Viking women whose experiences we've explored offer remarkable examples of how such navigation can be accomplished with intelligence, courage, and moral sensitivity that deserve our continued study and respect. Their legacy continues to influence how we think about the relationship between individual agency and systemic constraints, the psychology of power and resistance, and the possibilities for creating meaning and exercising influence even within the most challenging circumstances. Understanding their experiences helps us better understand our own possibilities and responsibilities as we work to create societies that honor human complexity while providing greater support for individual flourishing and collective well-being. The most startling revelation about Viking women's psychological complexity emerges when we examine how they processed the constant threat of violence that permeated their daily existence. This wasn't just about the fear of enemy raids or military conflicts. It was about understanding that their own safety depended on maintaining delicate balances within relationships, where the line between protection and control was razor thin. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites across Scandinavia reveals a disturbing pattern. Female skeletal remains often show signs of healed fractures, particularly to the ribs and forearms, that suggest defensive injuries. But these injuries appear alongside evidence of high-status burials and material wealth, indicating that violence and privilege could coexist in the same woman's life. This creates a psychological puzzle that modern researchers are only beginning to unravel. How did Viking women maintain their sense of agency and self-worth, while living under the constant possibility of physical harm from the very people who were supposed to protect them? The answer seems to lie in developing what we might call threat assessment intelligence. Viking women became extraordinarily skilled at reading social situations for signs of potential danger. They learned to recognize the subtle cues that indicated when male family members or community leaders were becoming frustrated, angry, or feeling threatened by female success. They developed strategies for de-escalating potentially violent situations while still pursuing their own objectives. This threat assessment intelligence shows up in the saga literature through female characters who demonstrate almost supernatural ability to predict and manage interpersonal conflicts. They seem to know instinctively when to push forward with their agendas and when to step back to avoid triggering violent reactions. They understand how to frame their successes in ways that enhance rather than threaten male honor. But this constant vigilance came at enormous psychological cost. Imagine living every day knowing that your achievements could be interpreted as challenges to male authority, that your words could be twisted into insults requiring violent response, that your success could trigger resentment that might explode into physical aggression without warning. The archaeological evidence suggests that some women developed what we might call protective strategies that involved deliberately limiting their own visibility and success to avoid triggering these violent reactions. We find female graves that contain evidence of substantial wealth and influence, but arranged in ways that seem designed to minimize rather than display that success. These burial patterns tell stories about women who understood that survival sometimes required hiding their capabilities rather than celebrating them. They accumulated wealth and influence, but they did so quietly and carefully to avoid provoking the defensive reactions that could destroy everything they had worked to build. This protective invisibility created its own psychological challenges. How do you maintain your sense of self-worth when you have to constantly downplay your achievements? How do you build confidence and ambition when expressing those qualities too openly could literally be deadly? The saga literature provides glimpses of women who struggled with these contradictions through characters who seem to alternate between periods of remarkable assertiveness and strategic withdrawal. These literary portrayals probably reflect real psychological patterns among women who had to manage their own ambitions within systems that could punish female success unpredictably and violently. Some women seem to have dealt with this challenge by developing what we might call episodic assertiveness. Rather than maintaining constant high profiles, they learned to identify specific moments when they could safely express their capabilities and pursue their objectives more openly. They became skilled at recognizing windows of opportunity when male attention was focused elsewhere, or when their success could be framed as supporting rather than challenging male authority. This episodic approach to exercising agency required extraordinary psychological discipline and strategic thinking. It meant constantly suppressing natural impulses towards self-expression and achievement in favor of careful calculation about timing and presentation. It required the ability to remain patient and alert for extended periods while waiting for safe opportunities to pursue personal goals. The religious contradictions take on new psychological dimensions when viewed through this lens of threat management. The Velour weren't just claiming divine authority randomly, they were accessing a form of power that was less likely to trigger violent male reactions because it was framed as service to the gods rather than personal ambition. But even religious authority had to be exercised carefully to avoid provoking defensive reactions. A vulva who delivered prophecies that consistently contradicted male preferences would quickly find her divine connection questioned and her physical safety threatened. Success required understanding how to use spiritual authority to influence outcomes while maintaining the appearance of neutral service to higher powers. The archaeological evidence shows us velour graves that contain both symbols of religious authority and signs of physical trauma, suggesting that even women who accessed divine power weren't immune to violence when they miscalculated or pushed too hard against social boundaries. This pattern reveals something crucial about how Viking society managed the contradiction between respecting female spiritual authority and maintaining male political dominance. The system worked as long as women understood that their religious power was conditional and contextual rather than absolute and universal. The marriage and family contradictions become even more complex when we consider the psychological impact of living with the constant possibility that intimate relationships could become sources of mortal danger. Viking women had to develop strategies for maintaining emotional connections with male family members, while understanding that those same men could legally kill them under certain circumstances. This created what we might call intimacy with threat assessment, where every personal relationship required constant monitoring for signs of shifting power dynamics and potential violence. A woman had to be alert to changes in her husband's mood, her father's political situation, or her brother's honor status that could suddenly transform protective relationships into dangerous ones. The saga literature provides numerous examples of women who demonstrate remarkable skill at managing these intimate threat assessments. They seem to understand intuitively how to maintain emotional bonds with potentially dangerous men while protecting themselves from the worst consequences of male anger and frustration. But this constant emotional vigilance must have made genuine intimacy incredibly difficult to achieve. How do you fully trust someone who has the legal right to kill you? How do you maintain loving relationships when you always have to be calculating the potential for violence? Some women seem to have dealt with this challenge by developing compartmentalized approaches to emotional relationships. They learn to separate their feelings of affection and loyalty from their strategic assessments of safety and security. They could love their male relatives while still maintaining psychological distance and defensive preparations. This emotional compartmentalization allowed them to function within family systems that were simultaneously sources of protection and potential danger. But it also meant that their most intimate relationships were shaped by underlying currents of fear and calculation that must have been psychologically exhausting to maintain. The economic contradictions reveal another dimension of how Viking women managed the psychological stress of living under constant threat. Women who built successful businesses had to develop strategies for protecting their wealth from confiscation or destruction by male relatives who might feel threatened by female economic success. This wasn't just about hiding money or assets. It was about understanding how to frame economic achievements in ways that enhanced, rather than challenged, male honor and authority. A successful female merchant had to present her business success as contributing to family prosperity rather than as evidence of her personal capabilities. The archaeological evidence shows us female merchants who clearly accumulated substantial wealth, but who seem to have invested that wealth in ways that built male loyalty and protection rather than displaying female independence. They used their economic success to strengthen family bonds and community relationships that could provide security when their circumstances changed. This strategic use of wealth required sophisticated understanding of male psychology and social dynamics. Women had to understand not just how to make money, but also how to spend and invest it in ways that would minimize resentment and maximize protection from the men who could potentially destroy their businesses and confiscate their assets. The slavery contradictions take on additional psychological complexity when we consider how owning other people affected women's understanding of their own vulnerability and agency. Female slave owners had to develop ways of thinking about power and protection that allowed them to exercise authority over enslaved people while understanding that their own authority was conditional and potentially precarious. This created what we might call hierarchical threat assessment, where women had to simultaneously manage their relationships with people they had power over and people who had power over them. They needed to understand how to exercise authority over slaves in ways that wouldn't provoke criticism from male relatives who might question their judgment or capabilities. At the same time, they had to recognize that their ownership of slaves depended entirely on maintaining their own status within family and community hierarchies. A woman who fell from favor or lost male protection could quickly find herself in situations where her own freedom and safety were threatened. This psychological complexity around power and vulnerability shows up in the saga literature through female characters who seem to understand intuitively the precarious nature of all social positions. They recognize that today's slave owner could become tomorrow's victim, that current privileges could disappear rapidly if circumstances changed. Some women seem to have used this understanding to develop more nuanced approaches to exercising power over enslaved people. They recognized that treating slaves with unnecessary cruelty could create enemies who might become dangerous if social circumstances shifted. They understood that building loyalty and cooperation among household members, including enslaved people, could provide additional security in uncertain times. But this strategic approach to slave ownership also reveals the psychological costs of living within systems that required constant calculation about power relationships and potential threats. Women had to develop ways of thinking about human relationships that were fundamentally shaped by considerations of dominance, submission, and mutual vulnerability. The cumulative psychological impact of managing all these contradictions and threats simultaneously must have been extraordinary. Viking women had to develop mental frameworks that could handle multiple, often conflicting demands for strategic thinking, emotional management, and moral reasoning while maintaining their basic psychological stability and sense of identity. The archaeological evidence suggests that some women thrived under these conditions, developing remarkable skills and achieving impressive successes despite the constraints they faced. But the same evidence also shows signs of the psychological toll that this constant strategic thinking extracted from women's lives. Recent bioarchaeological studies are revealing patterns of stress-related health problems in Viking women's skeletal remains that reflect the physical impact of chronic psychological pressure. Evidence of premature aging, immune system dysfunction, and stress-related injuries suggests that many women paid significant health costs for their strategic consciousness and threat management skills. These biological markers help us understand that the psychological frameworks Viking women developed for managing contradictory social positions, while remarkably sophisticated and often effective, came at enormous personal costs that aren't always visible in traditional historical sources. The recognition of these costs doesn't diminish our appreciation for Viking women's intelligence and resilience. Instead, it helps us understand the full scope of what they accomplished and the prices they paid for their achievements. It also reminds us that celebrating their strategic consciousness shouldn't obscure the fact that they were operating within systems that created unnecessary suffering and constrained human potential in ways that we should continue to work to address. The psychological legacy of Viking women's threat management strategies extends far beyond medieval Scandinavia. The mental frameworks they developed for assessing and managing multiple sources of potential danger while pursuing personal objectives continue to influence how people think about safety, agency, and strategic thinking in threatening environments. Many of the psychological challenges that Viking women faced persist in different forms in contemporary societies. People today still navigate situations where their success might trigger resentment or backlash from others. They still face pressure to balance personal ambitions with the need to maintain protective relationships. They still have to develop strategies for exercising agency while managing various forms of vulnerability and threat. The approaches that Viking women developed for these challenges involve sophisticated understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and risk assessment that remains relevant for people facing similar dilemmas today. Their experiences offer insights into how people can maintain their sense of identity and pursue their objectives even when operating within systems that create constant pressure and potential danger. But understanding these psychological frameworks also requires acknowledging the enormous mental and physical costs that people pay when they have to live under constant threat assessment and strategic calculation. The skills that enabled Viking women to survive and sometimes thrive within dangerous systems came at prices that affected their health, relationships, and basic quality of life in ways that we're only beginning to understand. The continuing study of Viking women's psychological experiences offers important lessons for understanding human adaptability and resilience under extreme conditions. Their story demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human intelligence and creativity to develop sophisticated strategies for managing multiple threats and contradictions simultaneously. But their story also illustrates the costs of systems that require people to live under constant vigilance and strategic calculation without providing stable foundations for safety and security. Understanding these costs can help us recognize the importance of working towards social arrangements that honor human complexity, while providing greater consistency and support for individual flourishing without the need for constant threat assessment and defensive maneuvering. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new aspects of how Viking women managed these psychological challenges, and our understanding of their mental strategies will undoubtedly continue to evolve as new discoveries provide additional insights into their experiences. But the fundamental recognition that these women developed remarkably sophisticated psychological frameworks for managing impossible situations seems likely to remain central to our understanding of their lives and their legacy. Their experiences remind us that human psychology is extraordinarily adaptable and that people can develop complex strategies for maintaining their humanity and agency, even within systems that seem designed to create constant fear and uncertainty. Understanding how they accomplish this can provide guidance and inspiration for people who face their own threatening circumstances and need to develop their own strategies for survival and success within imperfect and dangerous systems. The psychological frameworks that Viking women created for managing contradictions and threats continue to offer valuable insights into human resilience and the persistent capacity for strategic thinking and moral reasoning, regardless of external pressures and constraints. Their legacy challenges us to develop better understanding of how people can maintain their sense of identity and agency while working within threatening systems toward gradual improvement and positive change. But it also reminds us that requiring people to live under constant threat assessment and strategic calculation exacts enormous costs that affect every aspect of human flourishing. The courage and intelligence that Viking women brought to managing impossible situations deserve our continued study and respect. But their experiences also highlight the importance of working towards societies that provide greater safety and security for all people, regardless of their gender, status, or circumstances. The story of Viking women's psychological strategies for managing contradictory and threatening social positions offers both inspiration and warning for contemporary efforts to understand and address ongoing inequalities and injustices. Their experiences demonstrate what human beings can accomplish even under the most challenging conditions, but they also illustrate what we lose when societies fail to provide adequate protection and support for all their members. Understanding their legacy can help us better appreciate both the remarkable capacity of human resilience and the continuing importance of working towards social arrangements that honor that resilience while reducing the need for the kind of constant strategic vigilance that shaped every aspect of Viking women's daily existence. The final contradiction that emerges from understanding Viking women's psychological complexity is perhaps the most profound of all. These women developed extraordinary capabilities for strategic thinking, threat assessment, and social navigation that made them some of the most psychologically sophisticated people in medieval Europe. Yet this very sophistication trapped them within systems that demanded they use their intelligence primarily for survival, rather than for creative expression or genuine self-actualization. Think about what this means in practical terms. A Viking woman might possess the analytical skills of a modern diplomat, the emotional intelligence of a trained therapist, and the strategic thinking abilities of a military commander. But instead of using these remarkable capabilities to build new institutions, create innovative solutions to social problems, or pursue intellectual and artistic achievements, she had to channel almost all of her mental energy into the exhausting work of navigating contradictions and managing threats. This represents a staggering waste of human potential that we're only beginning to understand. The archaeological evidence shows us women who clearly possessed extraordinary intelligence and capabilities, but who were forced to express those gifts within such narrow constraints that their full potential was never realized. We can only imagine what Viking civilization might have accomplished if these women had been free to apply their remarkable psychological skills to broader creative and intellectual challenges. The bioarchaeological evidence reveals another dimension of this tragic waste. Analysis of female skeletal remains shows patterns of stress-related health problems that indicate many women were literally dying from the psychological pressure of constant strategic thinking and threat management. Their extraordinary mental capabilities were killing them through chronic stress that affected every system in their bodies. This creates a paradox that modern scholars are still struggling to understand. Viking society produced women with remarkable psychological sophistication precisely because it subjected them to impossible contradictions and constant threats. The very conditions that developed their extraordinary capabilities were also destroying their health, limiting their opportunities, and preventing them from achieving their full potential. Recent advances in cognitive archaeology are providing new insights into how this psychological development actually occurred. Evidence from domestic sites shows that Viking girls were exposed to complex social negotiations and strategic thinking challenges from very early ages. They learned to read social situations, assess threats, and manage contradictory demands as basic survival skills rather than as specialized professional capabilities. This early exposure to psychological complexity created women who were extraordinarily skilled at understanding human behavior and social dynamics. But it also meant that they never experienced the kind of psychological safety and stability that allows for genuine creativity and intellectual exploration. They were always operating in survival mode, even when they achieved remarkable success within their constrained circumstances. The saga literature provides glimpses of what Viking women might have accomplished if they had been free to pursue their intellectual interests without constant strategic calculations. We find examples of female characters who demonstrate remarkable insights into human nature, sophisticated understanding of political dynamics, and creative approaches to problem solving that suggest capabilities that extended far beyond what their social circumstances allowed them to express. But these literary portrayals also reveal the tragedy of unrealized potential. Even the most successful saga women are ultimately constrained by the systems they operate within. Their intelligence serves primarily to help them navigate impossible situations rather than to create new possibilities for themselves and their communities. This pattern of constrained brilliance appears repeatedly in the archaeological record. We find evidence of women who clearly possessed extraordinary capabilities, but who could only express those capabilities within the narrow channels that their society provided. They became master strategists and psychological manipulators, not because they chose those roles, but because those were the only ways they could exercise their intelligence without triggering violent reactions. The religious contradictions take on new meaning when viewed through this lens of constrained potential. The volur represented one of the few socially acceptable ways for women to exercise intellectual and creative capabilities openly. But even this religious authority was carefully circumscribed to ensure it didn't challenge fundamental power structures. Archaeological evidence from volur graves suggests these women often possessed remarkable knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, geography, and natural sciences that they incorporated into their religious practices. They were essentially medieval scientists and scholars who had to disguise their intellectual pursuits as divine inspiration because direct scholarly activity was forbidden to women. This forced disguise of intellectual capability as religious authority reveals the tragedy of what Viking civilization lost by constraining female potential. These women might have made remarkable contributions to Viking Age knowledge and innovation if they had been free to pursue scholarly activities openly. Instead, their discoveries and insights were filtered through religious frameworks that limited their broader application and development. The economic contradictions show us another dimension of this constrained brilliance. Female merchants who built successful international trading networks clearly possessed sophisticated understanding of economics, logistics, cultural anthropology, and international relations. They were essentially medieval business executives and cultural diplomats, operating without official recognition or institutional support. The archaeological evidence shows these women managing complex supply chains, coordinating international partnerships, and developing innovative business practices that kept Viking communities connected to global trade networks. But they had to accomplish all of this through informal channels that made their contributions largely invisible to the formal institutions that recorded and preserved knowledge. This invisibility meant that the remarkable innovations and insights these women developed were often lost when they died, rather than being passed on to future generations through institutional memory. Viking civilization repeatedly lost valuable knowledge and capabilities because the women who developed them couldn't participate in the formal systems that preserved and transmitted intellectual achievements. The marriage and family contradictions reveal perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this constrained potential. Viking women who possessed extraordinary psychological and intellectual capabilities often found themselves trapped in family relationships that provided physical security but prevented them from using their gifts for broader social contributions. A woman who might have been a brilliant diplomat or military strategist instead found herself managing household politics and family alliances. A woman who could have been an innovative craftsperson or merchant instead focused her creative energies on navigating marriage negotiations and child-rearing responsibilities within constraining social expectations. This doesn't mean that household management and family relationships weren't valuable or important work, but it does mean that Viking society was systematically underutilizing some of its most capable people by limiting them to narrow roles that couldn't fully engage their intellectual and creative potential. The slavery contradictions add another layer of tragedy to this pattern of constrained brilliance. Some of the most psychologically sophisticated Viking women were those who had to manage the moral complexities of owning other human beings. They developed remarkable insights into human psychology and social dynamics through their struggles with these ethical contradictions. But this psychological sophistication came at enormous moral cost and served ultimately to perpetuate rather than challenge systems of oppression. Women who might have become moral philosophers or social reformers instead channeled their ethical reasoning into finding ways to participate in unjust systems while maintaining their sense of personal integrity. The archaeological evidence suggests that some enslaved women also possessed extraordinary capabilities that were completely wasted by their social circumstances. Female slaves who were clearly intelligent and skilled were used primarily for manual labor and domestic service, rather than for activities that could have utilized their intellectual potential. This represents a double tragedy where both free and enslaved women were prevented from realizing their full capabilities, though obviously the enslaved women faced far more severe constraints and suffered much greater injustices. The entire system of slavery meant that Viking society was systematically destroying human potential on a massive scale. When we consider the cumulative impact of all these constrained capabilities, the picture that emerges is of a civilization that was operating far below its potential because it couldn't effectively utilize the intelligence and creativity of half its population. The remarkable achievements of Viking Age Scandinavia become even more impressive when we recognize that they were accomplished despite this massive waste of human resources. But this recognition also raises disturbing questions about what Viking civilization might have accomplished if it had found ways to channel female intelligence and creativity into broader social contributions. The technological innovations, artistic achievements, and intellectual developments that were lost because of gender constraints represent one of history's great tragedies of unrealized potential. Modern computational modeling of social systems suggests that civilizations that effectively utilize the capabilities of all their members achieve dramatically higher levels of innovation and prosperity than those that constrain significant portions of their population. Viking society's failure to fully engage female potential probably limited its overall development in ways that we're only beginning to understand. This has implications that extend far beyond historical curiosity. Understanding how Viking society constrained and wasted female potential can help us recognize similar patterns in our own societies and work more effectively to address them. The psychological frameworks that Viking women developed for managing contradictions and constraints continue to be relevant because many of the underlying problems they faced haven't been fully resolved. The legacy of Viking women's constrained brilliance challenges us to think more carefully about how contemporary societies might be underutilizing human potential through various forms of discrimination, inequality, and systemic constraint. Their experiences remind us that remarkable capabilities can develop even under oppressive conditions, but that allowing those capabilities to flourish requires creating social structures that support rather than constrain human potential. The continuing study of Viking women's experiences offers important lessons for understanding how societies can better identify and nurture human capabilities, regardless of gender, social status, or other characteristics that have historically been used to limit people's opportunities. Their story demonstrates both the remarkable resilience of human intelligence and creativity and the tragic costs of systems that prevent that intelligence and creativity from being fully expressed. But perhaps the most important lesson from Viking women's experiences is the recognition that constrained brilliance isn't just an individual tragedy. It's a collective loss that affects entire societies by preventing them from accessing the full range of human capabilities needed to address complex challenges and create innovative solutions. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new examples of Viking women whose remarkable capabilities were constrained by their social circumstances. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of what was lost when these women couldn't fully express their potential. But these discoveries also inspire us to work toward creating societies that can better recognize and support human capabilities, regardless of the social categories that have historically been used to limit them. The story of why Viking women were both feared and oppressed ultimately reveals something fundamental about the relationship between individual capability and social structure. It shows us that remarkable human potential can emerge even under the most constraining circumstances, but that allowing that potential to flourish requires deliberate effort to create supportive social environments. Viking women's experiences remind us that the work of building more just and equitable societies isn't just about addressing obvious forms of discrimination and oppression. It's also about recognizing and eliminating the subtle constraints and contradictions that prevent people from realizing their full potential, even when they aren't facing direct persecution. Their legacy challenges us to think more deeply about how we can create social structures that honor human complexity while providing consistent support for individual flourishing. It reminds us that the remarkable capabilities humans can develop under pressure are better channeled toward creative and constructive purposes than toward mere survival and strategic maneuvering. Understanding Viking women's constrained brilliance helps us appreciate both the extraordinary resilience of human intelligence and the continuing importance of working towards societies that can effectively utilize the full range of human capabilities for the benefit of all. Their story offers both inspiration about what people can accomplish under impossible circumstances and motivation to create circumstances where such remarkable capabilities can be expressed more freely and constructively. The contradiction between fear and oppression that defined Viking women's lives wasn't an accident or an oversight in their social system. It was the inevitable result of a civilization that recognized female capability, but couldn't find ways to integrate that capability into its formal structures without threatening its basic assumptions about power and authority. This recognition helps us understand that the challenges Viking women faced weren't unique to their time and place. They represent a broader pattern that appears throughout history whenever societies develop systems that simultaneously depend on and constrain the capabilities of particular groups of people. The psychological sophistication that Viking women developed for managing these contradictions continues to offer insights that are relevant for people facing similar challenges today. But their experiences also remind us that individual resilience and strategic thinking, while remarkable and admirable, aren't sufficient solutions to systemic problems that require collective action and structural change. The story of Viking women's constrained brilliance ultimately calls us to work toward creating societies that can honor human potential without requiring people to pay the enormous psychological and physical costs that these remarkable women endured. Their legacy challenges us to build systems that support rather than constrain human flourishing, that recognize rather than waste human capabilities, and that create opportunities for all people to contribute their gifts to the common good. In the end, the question of why Viking women were both feared and oppressed reveals itself to be a question about the fundamental challenges of human social organization. Their experiences show us both the remarkable things people can accomplish within constraining systems and the tragic costs of those constraints for individuals and societies alike. Their story reminds us that the work of creating more just and equitable societies requires not just moral conviction, but also deep understanding of how complex systems actually function and how they can be changed to better serve human flourishing. The intelligence, courage, and resilience that Viking women brought to managing impossible contradictions deserve our continued study and respect, but their experiences also highlight the continuing importance of working towards societies where such remarkable capabilities can be expressed more freely and constructively for the benefit of all. The legacy of Viking women's experiences continues to influence how we think about gender, power, and human potential. Their story offers both sobering lessons about the costs of systemic constraints and inspiring examples of human resilience and creativity under pressure. Understanding their experiences helps us better recognize both the challenges we continue to face and the possibilities we can create for building more supportive and equitable societies that honor the full range of human capabilities and potential.